Just think of all the places mankind could go. Another galaxy, another...
Stranger Things video.
If
Stranger Things video.
did exist, they would be extraordinarily unstable.
Stranger Things Season 5 is almost brilliant, but they've made a mistake, and so far, obviously we have to wait for the entire season before we can judge it as a whole, but I think it's created a few issues that have dampened what would have otherwise been a pretty strong beginning to the season. And if you can guess what the mistake is before we get to it, I will be mighty impressed. Despite that, I am really enjoying the season. We're going to discuss both the good and the bad. Let's not waste any more time other than to let the train arrive. So let's start with a good point. I am really happy to see how much the world has changed, finally. Like, don't get me wrong, the very small, contained feel of Season 1 carried a great charm. A charm I prefer to something so blockbuster and colossal. I definitely preferred that. However, the show inevitably had to expand as it went along, and if you're even here making a 5th season of Stranger Things, I think it then really needs to commit to that. It frustrated me, for example, in Season 3 that the meat sludge mind flayer thing smashed up an entire hospital and then the mall was burned down, and the wider public learned almost nothing about any of this. Apart from a vague idea of the town being cursed, nothing changes in the world, and that removes all of the weight. Events need to have an impact on the world in the same way they need to impact characters if you want the audience to feel it as strongly as possible. So it was then nice. Season 4 ended with Hawkins being ripped apart, and it's nice to see that evolve now. It's nice to see that has impacted things. The whole town is under quarantine in Season 5. We've got big metal sheets covering the ground, and the gang has been organising some sort of resistance force. Why all of the citizens were quarantined rather than evacuated and placed in the military, I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think it's nonsense and I like it. I really like the radio wave thing the military used to cancel out 11, let's say. Again, that just feels like a natural evolution in the story. Of course the military would be working on ways to combat her. It makes sense, it adds a whole new threat that had me genuinely on edge for how she and Hopper would survive at that lab when the alarms went off. I mean, as it was, barely any soldiers came along and they got ages of time, but for a second I was on edge. And similarly, kind of surprisingly, but I actually really like how capable all of the kids have become here. I think it comes across as quite sweet rather than forced. You think back to them scrounging pebbles for Lucas's slingshot in Season 1, or Dustin building his ham radio in Season 3. Now look at them. They've got entire radio towers and satellites on cars. They're rigging up beamers and Home Alone traps that now become a very professional gig. It's both very impressive and a bit concerning how effortlessly they cut out the entire middle of somebody's house just to put in a pit. Again, it doesn't have the same charm as scrounging for pebbles, obviously, but it feels like a natural evolution rather than just powering them up for contrived plot reasons. The cast are a lot older, therefore they've allowed space in the story to suit that, and it does feel very sweet. I'd feel kind of proud to see how far they've come, especially with how strong of a network they are. Okay, it is a bit surprising just how efficiently they've sprung up this covert resistance. However, after pretty much every season of all of the characters beginning the show scattered and disparate, you know, in Season 2 nobody had a clue what Jonathan and Nancy were doing, in Season 3 no one knew where Joyce and Hopper were, and in Season 4 actually. And not just that they were spread out in those examples, but there wasn't a sense of teamwork and support between those separate groups, you know? This time 11 and Hopper are separated, but the others are still trying to get in contact, still have an idea what they're doing, still feel part of a team. They've got a whole system in place here of coded radio commands and walkie-talkies, and I find it really endearing to see how their little community has developed in that sense. And I think everything has evolved this season. The size of the sets, the use of effects, the amount of bullets, the action set pieces. Karen trying to protect Holly was a really well executed sequence. Obviously Vecna's appearance at the end of episode 4. I don't like this new design for Vecna, by the way. I think he looks a bit too much like a generic CGI design for a badass villain, rather than someone human who's been stripped of a lot of that humanity and become a little grotesque. I think this change harms some of the metaphor for Vecna as an abuser user. Yeah, again, I do prefer the small contained charm of Season 1, but they had to go big here, and I'm relieved they committed to that. They went all in, no holding anything back. Let's have one last chaotic rollercoaster ride for old time's sake. And even when I objectively think there's a lot of faults with this season, it's still so much fun. We shouldn't discount the importance of fun here. It makes for a very, very good time. However, is there anything else good about this season? But first...
What is it? I don't know, but I could feel it's important.
World Anvil! Yep, they are sponsoring this video. World Anvil is an online tool for game masters, for writers, for tabletop RPG players and world builders. An online tool for designing worlds, creating characters, chronicling history, planning and managing campaigns from a plethora of different games. My best friend uses it for our D&D campaign, I use it for planning my novel. Far better and easier than the scraps of random A4 paper stuffed into a drawer that used to constitute my creative process. Not only can I keep everything in one place where I can easily edit anything I want to, but I can create timelines, hyperlinks branching off to specific characters or articles, family trees, a billion other things. You can even link them all to maps, like here's this basic map I made years ago. If I click on the character Tess, it sends me straight to her page where everything is redacted, and that's like the most basic thing you can do with your maps. There's other creators whose world building looks so much nicer than mine. There's a whole community network on World Anvil if that's your thing. There's so many different cool features for everything you may possibly need. In general, there's been lots of great updates recently, making the interface even simpler and smoother than it already was. World Anvil is great. I am genuinely passionate. I hope you can hear that. And if you desire, if you crave, if you call to the heavens for a 51% discount, then use the code TREE, or click the link in the description or the pinned comment. And if you just want to try out the free version, then go for it. There's no time limit. Test it out for as long as you want. World Anvil. Unsurprisingly, I really like what they've done with Will so far this season. However, I discussed all of that in my last video on the psychology of Vecna and of Will. You can watch that video if you're interested for all of my thoughts. I won't tread the same ground again, other than to say that Will is the best thing about this season so far. I actually really liked Derek because this again is a natural evolution. All of the original kids have grown up and there should be a younger crop of kids beneath them that they can now help out and nurture. Mike's advice to Holly, and then Max is with Holly. There's a whole team trying to save kids from the army base, but Derek I think especially carries a strong theme of community support in this sense. But like most of season 4 was about Vecna targeting people who felt alone, right? Our main cast know that. Suddenly we have the kid everybody calls dipshit Derek, and it's easy for them to dislike him, and he's a bit of a bully to Holly. He's loud and a bit obnoxious, and also understandably very defensive when he thinks he's being kidnapped. That's a very bizarre plot point when you think about it. However, if you give this kid space and let him feel supported, you have Joyce telling him he's not dipshit Derek, he's delightful Derek, and suddenly you realise he's the sweetest kid in the world underneath. I mean, I liked him immediately, but the characters obviously didn't. They underestimated him, saw him a bit like a freak, dare we say, in a different sense of the words, but a bit useless and annoying, and these kids know better than anyone what it's like to be isolated, what it's like to be an outcast. It's very sweet how quickly they start to care, and then how Derek starts to thrive. And it's all a perfect contrast to a very disturbing predatory villain kidnapping children that he thinks are weak and easily manipulated. Our gang of kids have gone through the ringer several times now. It's then just very satisfying to see them attempt to look out for the new kids on the block, and so very fitting for the final season. In terms of comedy, I think some of it works for me. It's less so people just shouting all the time than season 3 was. I mean, you do get some of that, like with between Steve and Dustin, but I buy that. Dustin, I think, is struggling with depression. Perhaps it contradicts with everything I just said about their community network to point this out, but nobody seems to notice how much Dustin is struggling and exactly what's going on under this abrasive exterior that winds Steve up so much and exasperates Mike and Will and Lucas. Dustin is clearly grieving Eddie, somewhat emulating him, even down to his hair, his rings, his shirt, where he sits at the lunch table, and the more he feels nobody else is grieving Eddie, the more it feels like a duty for him, and the more resistant he is to their comfort or their words as a result. I mean, they're not really giving Dustin any comfort at all. It effectively feels like they're saying, Dustin, stop caring about Eddie, we don't care about Eddie. Which isn't technically true, but that's how it feels for Dustin, and that's kind of the opposite of what they should be saying if they want to help him. I think it's no accident Dustin is putting himself in situations where he will get hurt. I think that's a pretty clear expression of the pain he's in. And then to basically be berated for getting hurt, yeah, that leads to an argument which I think is solid enough comedy with Steve in particular, and I'm really hoping to see that build into more of an emotional climax in the next episodes. If it doesn't, and Dustin is never properly explored, I will be disappointed. I also did have a good chuckle at Andy and his mates trying to act all big and intimidating in how they surround and greet Dustin. And then the last one just says hiya.
Hiya.
I like that a lot. There's little things like that I enjoy, and then there's things like making so many dick-related puns that you just have to roll your eyes.
Personally, for us, I like dick.
Some of them work okay, but other times you can feel the Duffer Brothers contorting the natural flow of dialogue just to fit another dick pun in. The comedy between Stephen and Jonathan I find dull. Their faint rivalry just doesn't carry enough emotional weight for me. I don't feel invested. It's not that you have to be emotionally invested in every argument and rivalry, but I think without that sense of something really interesting deeper under the surface, the kind of anger and tetchiness it draws up just isn't as engaging. I would rather both Steve and Jonathan got other things to do with their characters than just be drawn into this same dull love triangle season after season. Really, I think a lot of the dialogue can be a bit clunky in places this season. It's weird because they can definitely write really good dialogue, we see that. All I can think is things are hampered by this idea you hear of Netflix's strategy to make their shows easier for people to follow even if they're not watching the screen. Because the extreme lengths the characters do all go to keep spelling out exactly what their plans are and why they're so important. That does happen a lot and it does damage the dialogue, I think, but I also don't know if that's true. Look, I could go on vaguely mentioning different aspects that I mostly enjoyed or didn't enjoy, but it's about time we got to the real points. I think there's a bigger argument to be made. What do I think is the key issue with this season so far? Arguably, this is an unfair criticism because it's a byproduct of something I've praised as being necessary, which is how much this season commits to being a big, bombastic blockbuster that careers from one big moment to the next. I'm very glad they committed to that. It's very fun. However, you do then feel a lot of scenes don't have space to breathe because everything is constantly propelled forwards to the next big sequence. As much as I like what they've set up with Dustin, almost all of that occurred in the first episode before it's mostly then put on hold now that dangerous Vecna stuff starts happening again. Elle we see is training and is under a lot of pressure, but we don't see a huge amount else from her. I mean, every other season, 11 brought so much heart into the story, and whilst I'm glad Will is centre stage this time, it shouldn't mean Elle loses most of her substance, you know? Character-wise, most of her exploration this season is just from Hopper realising how capable she's becoming. And that's something for Hopper, but I don't think that's really much for her. For me, the best example is Holly. Holly's not given a huge amount of setup, but that's okay because the focus is more on this interesting idea that she talks to someone called Mr. Whatsit, and her parents are concerned about it, and I was intrigued. Who's Mr. Whatsit? Why can only Holly see him? The reveal that he's Henry isn't a massive surprise when you think about it, but it's still very intriguing, and in previous seasons, I think this would have been a big mystery component early on. However, the reveal comes very quickly. There isn't much space for mystery because the story charges ahead. And then Holly inside this memory prism I thought was really intriguing. She's given this house all to herself, told she shouldn't enter the woods and that Henry's going to be back at the end of the day. I was excited to see Holly's conflict of emotions here, the kind of fun of having this house slowly turning to boredom, loneliness, Holly perhaps slowly beginning to doubt the rule about the woods, but also not wanting to defy Henry and also afraid to go out there, but then finally venturing out and in the process meeting Max. There's a lot of interesting emotions Holly could go through at this point in the story, but almost immediately she's given a letter and then almost immediately she leaves. And then we meet Max, who tells us a story that also could have been really intriguing. I would have loved to watch this play out from Max's perspective as she first experiences all of this, all these weird memories, and there's a young Joyce and Max is confused what's going on, the audience slowly figuring it out with her. That would have been great. Max then finally making her way to the exits, and then it disappears and she has to flee before eventually settling into the comfortable imprisonment. Curious about why Henry won't enter the cave, but not sure. You know, I think those plot points are fine for Max. I think the story she tells is itself a good story, one that could be incredibly fascinating, but it's all told very quickly via exposition that I don't think is anywhere near as engaging. We don't have to be intrigued about this very intriguing aspect of the story because Max explains it to us, tells us what's going on. This is a prison inside Henry's memories. So, you know, I'm finding the show very fun, but not particularly intriguing. And it would have been nice if it could have been both. One final example before we get to the root problem here. As much as I said, it's great how the world has been impacted and feels evolved, we don't spend much time in that world. We very briefly see school, hospital, I suppose Vicky works there at least. We are aware of these metal sheets over the chasm and there is a quarantine, but for such a unique setup here, I'm very unsure how the wider community is feeling. How is everyone outside of our main gang of resistance? What's going on, you know? It feels underexplored. And when the Max Zeds, yes, I'm saying Z instead of Z, when that gets absolutely decimated in episode 4, I'm then not convinced there's going to be much more exploration to how the military presence affects the people of Hawkins. I'm suspicious it'll mostly occur in this empty but now much less dark and mysterious version of the Upside Down compared to how it was in previous seasons. You know, I don't begrudge the Upside Down feeling less mysterious than it once did. That there's kind of something almost colonial, perhaps, with the army going in there and chartering the land. But as a result, it's not as interesting a main setting for the season. It loses a lot of the eerie, ominous feel it once had. And I suspect we will return again to Hawkins later in this season. There will be some payoff to Andy, and you would presume Derek's family have a thing or two to say about being drugged. But I don't know if that feels like a vibrant, living community here. I am quite confused why Karen and Ted still knew nothing about anything going on at the start of this season. Like, I liked their obliviousness in season 1. I think it fitted well there, but to stretch it this far into the story, did he even know Mike has a girlfriend? Do they know that she has powers? I'm not sure. Maybe that was said somewhere, but I'm not sure. I'm also slightly confused about the setup. The Byers are staying at the Wheelers' house because they were down here at the end of season 4 when the quarantine was established and therefore haven't been able to leave. Okay. But then where's Argyle? Where's Enzo? I'm fairly sure they were also there at the same time. Look, I'm getting sidetracked. The point is, I'm sure a lot of criticisms out there will put all of this stuff down to just saying the pacing is too rushed. The story is going so fast that none of these interesting elements have proper space to be explored, but my hunch is if you slowed it all down, it would then feel too slow rather than a good speed. Because the beats they're hitting each episode work. Holly disappearing at the end of episode 1 / the start of episode 2. If anything, that's a long time to wait for an inciting incident. Discovering Henry as Mr. Watson at the end of episode 2, that makes sense. That episode is mostly the characters figuring out what's happened. Realising they need to save Derek at the start of episode 3 and then drawing up a plan and carrying it out for that episode, that makes sense. Ending that episode with Max appearing. Episode 4 then ramps things up because there's now a ton of kids to save, so they try to storm the military base at the same time. 11 tries to storm the lab where she thinks Henry is. You know, the basic storylines for each episode I think work. I think the pacing overall is fine. As much as I might like the idea, do we really have space to watch Max stumble her way through a prison, slowly figuring out what's going on before then returning to Holly and then the two of them meeting? No, I don't think we do. That would be too slow. My hunch is that it's not technically the pacing itself. I think it's just how big the cast is. there's so many different moving parts that all need a moment to shine and to be explored in some manner, that you would either have to make the story really slow in order to fit them all, or as we get here, they all end up a bit cramped and unable to fully breathe. Mike, Will, Lucas, Dustin, Eleven, Hopper, Joyce, Max, Robin, Steve, Jonathan, Nancy, Murray, Ted, Karen and Holly, Henry and Vecna, Sullivan, Dr. K is introduced, Erica, Derek. I don't know if Vicky will get more time, Carly, possibly I've forgotten some, but this is all a huge cast, and sometimes just having longer episodes doesn't accommodate all of them. So I think the big mistake, seeing all of this now, was that they didn't kill any of them off in season 4, or at least let them dip out of the story. You know, thank God Argyle and Enzo and Dr. Owens aren't here. I wish more of them weren't here, but due to satisfying conclusions that could have happened for their characters in season 4. Yep. With so many different moving parts, what we get here is a really fun, massive event of a season 5, but not as intriguing, not as much emotional depth outside of Will. Not all the dialogue and comedy works entirely for me, no, but those aren't as major an issue as the general loss of space to breathe, which I think is the root cause for a lot of the potential criticisms here. Now that the story has gotten going with the first 4 episodes, I am hoping it's going to be a lot easier to manage some of that for the rest of the season, but we don't know that yet. We're going to have to wait and see when those episodes are out. As it is, let me know what you think. Good or bad. Like this video if you liked it. Check out my other Stranger Things videos. Maybe subscribe or even support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or as a channel member. But otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Luke Core, Michael Gallagher, Ben Marie, Thafy, Chad Bramwell, and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.